Hello and welcome back to the Reform for Resilience European launch. My name is Diane Stone. I am one of the newly appointed professors in the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. And it's my pleasure today to be the moderator of the session on a healthier work environment. And some of the issues that we're going to cover today, and there are many issues in this particular topic, is what the workplace might look like in the future as we come out from the vicissitudes of the pandemic. So how can we make our workplaces healthier? How can we make our workforces more resilient as our business models and our working patterns are being transformed by the impact of the pandemic? And there are many positives in the stories as well as many significant challenges. I have to say, for me today, it is certainly a healthier work environment because I'm not sitting and working at my kitchen table. It is simply quite liberating to be able to see some of my colleagues face to face rather than on camera through Zoom. So what I would like to do before we tackle some of the big issues about a transformed workplace after we come through the pandemic, I'd like to introduce some of our speakers that we have on the panel today. We have three excellent speakers. So let me first mention Marcella Panucci, who's one of the Reform for Resilience commissioners. But also since February this year, Marcella has been head of cabinet at the Italian Ministry of Public Administration. But for many viewers, she's probably better known for her many years of service with Confindustria, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, which is the General Confederation of Italian Industry and the National Chamber of Commerce, where she was Director General until the middle of last year. But she has also worked earlier in her career at the DG for Competition in the European Commission, and she's also affiliated, she's got a teaching gig with Luis University in Rome, where she teaches public economic law. So she is one of our first panelists. We are also joined by Professor Franklin Lisk, who is a development economist and policy advisor, currently based at the University of Warwick in the UK, where he specializes in international political economy of African development, as well as global health governance, and has recently been appointed the Academic Director Africa in the university's executive office. Outside of Warwick, he holds many other positions, and he is a senior associate at the Center for Research on Political Economy in Dakar, Senegal, which he co-founded in 2009. For a number of years, he worked with the Geneva-based International Labour Organization, holding a number of positions, including being founding director of the ILO Global Program on HIV, AIDS, and the World of Work in 2000. So welcome. And also, last but certainly not least, we have Timo Lappi. And Timo is a growth entrepreneur based in Helsinki in Finland. His background is as a lawyer, and a lawyer who went on to be a co-founder of his own legal services Fondia, which was one of the first publicly listed law office in the Nordic countries. More recently, in the past 8 years, Timo has spent his time challenging occupational healthcare services market and was one of the co-founders of the company Helty, which is known as a disruptor amongst healthcare companies. And today, Helty has a team of 70 healthcare professionals who are responsible for the well-being and health of around 13,000 people. And Helty's approach is that it believes in preventative services instead of just medical care, and as well as making the best possible use of digital solutions in health services. So welcome to all. We have much to cover. And what I'd like to do is perhaps to start on a positive note. Before we get to some of the challenges for creating healthier working environments and opening economies in as safe as possible fashion. But I thought it would be good to first dwell upon some of the benefits that have actually emerged from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the kinds of new innovative practices that might have emerged, or the way in which we now think about work and reflect upon economic development. So, for example, last week, The Economist released its special its special report on the future of work, where it identified some positive signs amongst the gloom. So I wonder, and we might start first with Marcella. Marcella, do you think perhaps the pandemic has hastened some of the changes that perhaps were already underway, trends towards remote working, trends towards increased automation, as well as new digital and cross-border business models? Do you have some thoughts in this regard?
Thank you, Diane. It's a very challenging question to which I will try to answer, taking into account also my past experience as Director General of the biggest industrial association in Italy. And I find also some parallelism with the job that I'm doing now, because the public administration is the biggest employer in Italy. We count on 3.2 million civil servants. So I have both views of what's going on into the private sector and what's going on into the public sector. And it can be compared, and it's quite similar, because when the pandemic exploded, and unfortunately Italy was the first country in the Western world to experience it, we immediately skipped to the digital environment for many services and for work as well, and for schooling, for whatever else. The only services which were provided physically were the services to the persons, and specifically health services. And I noticed with some optimism, to be honest, that the country was ready to skip to the digital. Because in 1 week time, we were all working from home, and all the students were schooling from home. And that was really amazing, a sort of miracle. I have to be honest, I never expected that the country could be so ready to do that. And I always thought that if we had to plan it in advance, probably it would have taken us ages to do that. While in emergency, good or bad, but anyway, we did it. And the telecom system was okay. We experienced no blackouts, no problems on the network, and also digital services were able to support the country in the outbreak of the pandemic. So everything is okay? No, it's not. Because of course, we had two questions. The first one was that not all the areas in the country, and I can imagine in Europe and throughout the world, had the same level of digitalization and access to digital services as some, metropolitan areas or most developed areas in the country and in the regions. And that was a problem. And not all offices or schools had the same access to digital services. The same public administration was experiencing some problems with millions of acts and administrative practices which were stopped by the pandemic. So we have a workload which has increased over time. So the pandemic showed us that there's still a lot to do to re-engineer and digitalize services, and also re-engineer the way we organize the labor market and the labor and the employment within public and private organizations. Starting from that, I think that we call it smart working. I know that's not the right English terminology, but nonetheless in Italy it's very well spread, and we call smart working from home, which is not really smart for many people. But nonetheless, it's quite diffused, and it's posing some problems as well as opportunities, especially for families, for example. And we adopted some measures in the last few months in order to support families who were at home with small kids, doing digital schooling, and not being able, above all women, to look after the kids if they had to work from home. So there are many social problems which are connected to working from home that we have to try and face and solve, as well as not everybody's got a home who allows for home working with spaces, with technologies, with facilities. So there are many problems which are connected to this new way of working, and that we have to try and face, as well as we have to reflect on the fact that there are some kinds of employments and works that cannot be made from home. Services to person, for example, food, tourism, or whatsoever, they cannot be provided from home. So there were, and there's a very interesting article on The Economist, on the report The Economist made on how the labor market is changing, that talks about that. So there are luckier and less lucky workers that can allow working from home or not working from home. And especially most fragile workers, they cannot work from home, and they have to be very well protected. And that's let's say, an issue that you are posing to in this seminar today, which is very interesting to face. How do we protect our workers, essential workers, key workers who cannot work from home during a pandemic and afterwards? Of course, vaccines are the first mean to protect people, and also the first weapon we can use in order to relaunch economic growth. But nonetheless, vaccines are not yet generally available, and we also are experiencing some problems with the quantity of vaccines that can be used for the population.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know whether I'm going too long. Just feel free to stop me.
No. It's fine. It's fine. And yes, it's not that we're necessarily going to stay in this mode of smart working or remote working and being based in the home. Economies around the world will gradually open up, and governments obviously play a big role in informing communities about what is and what is not safe working conditions. But business has a role as well to play here. So it'd be interesting also to hear how business can be proactive in managing and helping develop a smooth as possible transition to the reopening, we hope in summer, of our workplaces to workers again and to clients.
Diane, I think it's what you say is absolutely correct, and we start having some data from the lockdown experience, during which many businesses, however, remained open. Those essential businesses like manufacturing companies, some manufacturing companies, or some services remained open. And the data we have is that they experienced a very low level of contagion within manufacturing companies or other kind of companies who were able to adopt very strict rules about worker safety. I remember at that time I was in Confindustria, and we signed 2 protocols with the trade unions in order to envisage the best measures to adopt in factories and in whatever business environment in order to allow workers to work safely. And luckily, those measures were successful. So I have to say that in that case, we can try and manage new openings, being, let's say, somehow sure that those measures will be adopted. But anyway, that's another question. We cannot stay closed forever, and we have to start and reopen, especially services like, for example, restaurants, shops, and so on. That's a huge part of the economy that has been hugely struck, and we have to try and think on how to do that. Of course, lots depends on vaccines.
Yeah,
We
this is
cannot
going to be
escape the question.
right. Yeah, this is going to be an inventive process, and it's not something that's just going to happen this year. The whole idea of building resilience is something that is a mindset. It's in a regulatory approach. It's about business responses over the next 2, 3, 5 years. This is something to be built into our economies, our workplaces, and firms. Does business have the resources to do this, given that economies have been so hard hit over the past year? What kind of resources do you think they need to start pushing ahead on these fronts, and workers and workers' bodies?
But on a more general plan, I think that loads of resources have been put into the economy in the last year. So I was reading a few days ago an article on the Financial Times on a new Washington consensus, which is spend, 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 and not cut anymore, which brought the United States to a huge package for the economy, as well as the European Union and also Italy. We invested more than 100 billion euros on social support, on liquidity, on supporting the economy in a wide sense. And that, of course, has somehow frozen the economy. We have a ban on layoffs as well, and lots of money which has been put on social bumpers. So what's going to happen when this all will be over? I hope that the investments we will put in place through the next generation EU facility that the European Union has approved will rebalance the possible shock on the economy deriving from the withdrawal of all support measures. So at the moment, companies can afford this, can afford taking measures and invest on worker safety.
Yeah.
We have to care about what's going to happen in the future.
Thank you. And Frank, I'm wondering, given that you were working on HIV/AIDS, and part of your past research has focused on Ebola, two other very different kinds of pandemics. What is there that we can possibly learn today in Europe, but also in other countries, from past pandemics and the responses that have taken place in the past in relation to managing pandemics and then redeveloping economies and ensuring safety for workforces?
Thank you very much, Diane.
Mm.
As you mentioned, I spent many years at the ILO, and there are three things about the ILO that I believe are quite relevant to the current pandemic, as well as to past pandemics and lessons from past pandemics for resilience and recovery with respect to COVID-19. First and foremost, the ILO has always emphasized the importance of partnerships, in this case, tripartite: government, business, and workers. And I believe that if you want to look at the impact of the pandemic globally or in the world of work, you need to look at the principal actors, how they interact with each other. So I think this is the first point. The second point would be to look at the impact of the pandemic on the labor market and on employment situation. I was fortunate in the year 2000 to have been invited by the Director General of the ILO to set up a new program within the organization, the Global Program on HIV/AIDS and the World of Work. And one of the first things I realized when I was given this responsibility was that not only is the HIV pandemic a global problem, but fundamentally it was a development challenge in the sense that because of the way the pandemic was perceived and because of the way the major actors reacted to the pandemic, it became first and foremost um, a, a factor in terms of human resource capacity. People were excluded on the basis of the assumption that they cannot participate in the labor market and they were discriminated against, they were stigmatized. So that's one important outcome, and it affected their access to productive and remunerative employment. And it also was a threat to their fundamental rights in terms of security, human security. I should also point out that ILO, like many UN organizations, thrive on slogans, but ILO, unlike many UN organizations, try to concretize the slogans into action and practice. When I joined the ILO, the slogan at the time was basic needs. Work should contribute to meeting basic needs of individuals and their families. And about the time I left the ILO, the slogan was on the quality of work, decent work. Everyone in the ILO was talking about decent work. What does it mean? Work should be productive, it should be adequately remunerative, it should be safe, it should be socially satisfying. Now, if you look at the the pandemic, well, let me go back to HIV and AIDS. Most of the requirements for decent work were breached by the way employers, in some cases, even governments, responded to the pandemic, and the ILO had to insist on some code of practice. And one of the first outputs of my new assignment at the time was to develop an ILO code of practice on HIV/AIDS and the world of work, which provided guidelines for action. Now, in the case of COVID, I mean, we don't have that problem in terms of stigma and discrimination, but what we have is the economic impact, which has been quite significant, the economic impact due to lockdowns, and it has contributed massively, particularly in the developing world, to loss of employment, exclusion. I read an Oxfam report which indicated that an estimated 50 million additional people in Africa will be pushed into extreme poverty on account of the labor market and unemployment impact of COVID. Now, the other point is that unlike HIV and AIDS, where the response at the global level was quite different from what we have experienced for COVID, at the global level, there was first and foremost international cooperation, which led to the establishment of a new UN organization, UNAIDS. And the second was this organization was given the responsibility to coordinate the global response. And it was supported by financial resources to ensure that the coordination of the global response was supported with material inputs. And this led to the establishment of the Global Fund, which was the largest financing agency to support uh, a disease that was not necessarily rampant in the global north. Even though the AIDS was essentially in the global south, it is quite interesting that there was this synergy and understanding between the global north and the global south of the importance to provide support. Now, unfortunately, in the case of COVID, what we have seen is one, a disconnect, total, as far as I can see, very little international cooperation. let alone coordination. The WHO, until recently, has not been allowed and has not been able to fulfill its role as in terms of international coordination, nor has there been cooperation between the major players or the major regions. For example, a lot has been said about vaccine apartheid, vaccine diplomacy, vaccine inequity. But
Mm-hmm.
what we see is that what is playing out in the area of vaccine is clearly, again, quite different from what came out from the experience of Ebola. When Ebola broke, particularly the West African Ebola, 2015 and 2016, it was amazing that the key, if I would use the phrase metropolitan countries, i.e., Britain, France, and the US, decided to address the problems in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia with some sort of coordination. So, what I'm trying to say is that there are certain lessons that come out clearly from the experience of earlier pandemics, which we should not overlook if we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about resilience and recovery. And let me just round up or mention again the ILO. You see, the ILO has been working in areas which are today relevant, but they've been doing it for quite a while, like homework. Now, everybody's talking about working from home. ILO has published quite a lot. But even from my time, years ago, homework was a very important aspects of ILO's agenda because ILO was looking at home working from the point of view of the disadvantages of working from home, except that now we're looking at home working or working from home from a more positive perspective. There are certain advantages, but we were ILO associated homework primarily with casual work, uncontracted work, piecework which exploited workers. Then the other area, which of course has been highlighted by COVID, is digitalization. Here again, we've been looking at, ILO has been looking at digitalization from the point of view of the application of automation in the workplace. Will people lose their jobs to machines? And this is
Yeah.
again playing out. So it will be interesting to see when we look at the situation in the context of a post COVID recovery, when so many things are going to happen, including reconfiguration of global supply chains, including the manner in which the people interpret work, we're going to see a need to come out with a new conceptualization of work. We're never going to go back to the old
Okay.
normal. And it is in this regard that I believe that there are lessons to be learned, both in terms of the impact of the pandemic on employment and the labor market, and with respect to the response as far as recovery and resilience are concerned.
Thank you, Frank. It was an interesting point that you made about the extent of global cooperation when it came to Ebola and HIV/AIDS, which stands in stark contrast to the vaccine nationalism of today.
Yeah,
And Italy, as it currently holds the G20 presidency, this is something to definitely have on the agenda when it's hosting the Global Health Summit later this year to talk about the forms of global cooperation and the lessons that can be learned from HIV, AIDS, and Ebola in the past that you're talking about. But you also mentioned the slogans of the ILO, and one of them today is human-centered recovery. And on this particular notice, I'd like to turn to Timo, given that he's a disruptor in healthcare. And I'm just wondering what you think the general requirements might be for something that's human-centered recovery in these new work environments, in the transformation of work, whether it's from home, some or part of the time or full time, but also what that means for companies that need to also encourage that amongst their workforce and manage this new mode of business and to ensure productivity in these processes.
Thanks, Diane. It's a great opportunity to get to attend this panel about healthier workplaces, since that's been the main object of my work since for the latest 8 years at the moment. I'd say that it's been a really interesting 15 months for a growth entrepreneur and also for a business leader working in the healthcare business. I think that I've been having three different perspectives for this time. First of all, the perspective of a grown entrepreneur trying to make new innovations and challenge the old ways of working and providing medical services. And then secondly, the viewpoint of a business leader who is ultimately responsible then for the well-being and health of 13,000 people here in Finland who are using our services. And then naturally also as a third issue, then as the CEO being then responsible for the well-being and health of 70 healthcare professionals who are working at our organization. I think that it's if we think about the positive sides of this extraordinary time, it's been then like fast forward in the development of healthcare services that were still very conservative before the COVID-19 area, I think. I think that there are two really interesting issues that are really my passion. First of all, it's so that you should be focusing more on preventive services instead of just providing medical care for sick people. There are numerous studies that show that it's much more cost effective, and it's also more effective in terms of time used by medical professionals if you are then targeting healthy people and really supporting them to stay healthy instead of just forgetting them and focusing on the sick people. And then as a second issue, also I think that let's have an example from another branch, for example, from banking. Still, maybe 20 years ago, people used to do so that when they got invoices, they really went physically to a bank and then paid the invoices there. How it's done then nowadays is that you get then the electronic invoices to your mobile phone, and then you just go there with your face ID, and that's done. Nobody would then like to go back to the traditional way of paying bills, at least in the Finnish environment. How about then, if you think about what you do then when you have then something to communicate with a doctor? 20 years ago, the traditional way of doing that was then to book an appointment and really physically go and visit the doctor. And I would say that the quite a lot the same system still continued last year until then COVID-19 started. And what was really interesting was that when naturally the lockdown started, there was a tremendous pressure then to try to create new ways of then communicating with doctors. And I would say that if you think about then doctors' appointments, all such appointments where you just are discussing, or then the doctor would be looking, or it would be listening, but not touching you. All of those could then be also done remotely. And what is the really positive side here is then that with digital solutions and with remote services, we will be then able to use the doctor's time in a more efficient manner. And we know that there's a constant scarcity of doctors' time all over the world all the time. And I think that it's positive news. Franklin just mentioned that there will be then technologies and digital solutions that will be then replacing people's work, and it might be threatening people. I think that the healthcare professionals, they have no threat at all, because then there will be constant need of their time, and then these new kind of services will then be enabling them to use their time in a more effective manner, really facing people and really actually meeting them. And then, sorry, Franklin.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to react to issue of digitalization and all these advances that would, in my view, to some extent, minimize the human-centered focus of the ILO. Um, Obviously, it is important to increase efficiency. It is necessary for the recovery. The recovery has to be cost effective, but at the same time, the recovery also has to be people centered in terms of how it affects the way people live and work. And already we have seen massive dynamics in the way in which we interpret work and in the way we use work as a source of livelihood and well-being. I think it was Michele who mentioned changes relating to the environment, and I think this will be particularly relevant. There's obviously there are going to be trade-offs with respect to uh, certain gains in productivity, which might impact uh, on environmental considerations, or certain gains in productivity, which might in fact impact on well-being and leisure.
Mm.
It would be very difficult to envisage people who have spent the last 12 months working from home going back to the rather rigid regime, starting with if you were working in a city, you have to commute the rush hour traffic. And I don't really see how people are going to get back into this old way of working without massively disrupting certain benefits that they have experienced.
Okay.
So it would be a matter of how do we rationalize the sort of changes that Timo is talking about with what I consider to be the non-quantifiable benefits
Yes.
from work, which we refer to in the ILO as the socially satisfying dimension of work.
Yeah.
Uh,
And on that note, Timo, it's a very big question, the intangible aspects of life. You mentioned that doctors have scarce time, and unfortunately, I'm getting messages that our time is becoming even more scarce. So perhaps if you could respond to that question and maybe bring in some of the points that you've seen in Finland about how we have that human-centered approach.
Yes, uh, I have a few interesting data points I would like to share with you, and I will just be making that very briefly. We have the statistics about the well-being and also then sicknesses and sickness leaves of around 13,000 people. And what happened then during 2020, the first part of that, during the first wave of COVID-19, was that the sickness leave rates, they dropped materially. That was positive news since the infections, they stopped spreading. And in addition, there were a lot less injuries because people, they just stayed home. But then what I think that is very relevant from the viewpoint of being then human-centric and supporting really people is that during the second wave of COVID-19, we identified a completely new phenomena that was that the mental challenge-based sickness leaves, they started skyrocketing. And also the demand for psychologist support by our members, it increased nearly 50%. So this says to us that people, they really will be needing support for the mental challenges. And still, what we have learned from previous crises at different workplaces is that part of people, they react during the crisis, but then there are also major parts who start to react only after the crisis has already been finished. And this is why I believe that also after we hopefully have returned to the offices next autumn, we see that there will be a huge need to support people mentally when they return back to their offices.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, it's been traumatic in many different ways for people, and I'm very sorry to say that we've run out of time in this particular session, and we've barely scratched the surface. But I do hope at some point in the future we can carry on this kind of conversation and talk about the reforms and transformations that are needed in the workforce in both the tangible and intangible sense, from the business perspective, the workers' perspective, and also quite clearly a governmental perspective as well. So thank you. Thank you very much for your time in joining the European launch of the Reform for Resilience Commission, and look forward to seeing you in the future.
As they used to say, good morning, America, good evening, Asia, and good afternoon, Europe. We are now in our last session of our European COVID Summit. I do apologize for some of the technical glitches that we've had, but when you least expect it, Mr. Murphy comes to visit with his laws. Could use a word that beep happens, and so it did this time around, but all of the recordings will be on our YouTube channel, and thanks for your patience and being with us. Without further ado, and without long introductions, because we will end at exactly past, I would like to introduce our next discussants, and I will do that in a very short fashion. In other words, we have with us Michelle Williams, professor and dean at Harvard University, or dean for Harvard School of Public Health. Welcome, William, and welcome, Michelle, and she's also the co-chair of our Resilience and Reform Commission. And secondly, we have with us my old friend and old colleague, among other things, former Foreign Minister of Singapore, George Yeo, who is also a member of our external advisory board at the School of Transnational Governance. Lovely to have you with us. Now, let's begin with Michelle. A very simple question, which is going to go to the two of you. what is your experience in the United States with COVID, and what is the situation right now?
Great, thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I suppose, to all. Alex, thank you for that question. So let me try to be brief, and I'll just basically say, in a lot of ways, in the United States, we are still playing catch up. Since January, we have managed to mount a more robust response to this pandemic with the onboarding of President Biden and his team that he had put together to robustly address this pandemic. We are up to having over 4 million, approximately 3.5 to 4 million vaccinations a day, and that's really important. We are trying to outrun the spread of variants, which threaten us all. But I will say that the goal of trying to vaccinate a majority of the population to reach this goal of herd immunity is proving to be an enormous challenge, partly operational and partly related to the high proportion of vaccine hesitancy. It doesn't help that the recent news around the very rare, very infrequent cases of blood clotting disorders related to the AstraZeneca vaccine doesn't help us, because it slows down our opportunity to have access to vaccines, but also increases cause for concern for hesitancy. On the economic side, I will say that we are opening up our economy in a disjointed, uncoordinated way. And in parts of the country where we've swung the doors open too quickly, the virus has traveled with people re-entering civil society in ways where we're now seeing increasing spread in more than half the states, and most concerning in Michigan, where the positivity rate for the virus is upwards of 15 to 17%. So let me just stop there, but there are reasons for optimism with increasing vaccination rates. There are reasons for concern with the rapid spread of the variants in some corners. And I will say that it is hard in the North American space to say that we have one pandemic. The dynamics of the virus and the responses to the virus have been so variable that it's a case of, if you've seen one, you've seen one. There's not a coordinated, robust, resilient, if you will, response that goes across the regions.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. It's very interesting to hear, the view, because of course what we do in Europe and elsewhere, we're online, we follow the debate, the discussion. We've just had a good one on disinformation and what is going on. I think one of the things that we can conclude is that the virus is like the pandemic, both of them mutate. And they mutate in many different ways, politically, socially, from a health perspective, and we're all trying to grapple with this. And the question then, George, to you is, how is Asia grappling with all of this? Because of course the message that we hear here in Europe is that, the Asians, they've done fantastically on this, no problems whatsoever. What's your take, George?
Singapore is a nice little bubble. I would say life is 70% back to normal, except for our international connections. And we are a tiny place, so we are, as it were, trapped in this little bubble. What is happening in other parts of East Asia is generally much better than in the West and in other parts of the world. But what is happening in China is like a different universe. It's a continental nation, and life there is 90% back to normal. They have concerts, they hold huge gatherings, trains are packed, domestic air travel is back to normal. And last year, despite COVID, they grew at 2.3%. And this year, they'll do comfortably over 8%. And the difference is, I would say, East Asian societies are generally more communitarian. There's no issue about wearing masks. And in fact, even before COVID, it's quite normal for individuals in Japan or Taiwan or Hong Kong to go to the office and wear a mask if they have a cough or a cold, and no one looks twice at the person. So the instincts are different. A crisis like this brings out the best and worst in us, and it's a test of social systems and how much we are prepared to sacrifice for a larger good. So we are seeing, I think, in the world today, quite a differential response to a common challenge.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is I said earlier on in the crisis that, man, having studied for 4 years, and Michelle will love this, in Greenville, South Carolina, Furman University. So I thought, when you start restricting the freedoms of Joe Sixpack in Columbia, South Carolina, all hell is going to break loose. And it did in the beginning. You could see that there was a sentiment of, anti-mask, anti-virus, denial, and the rest of it. And may I just, if I can jump onto this, because, is the difference here that in the United States and Europe, it's all about individual freedom, whereas in Asia, a lot of times it's about the collective thinking that, okay, I am willing to sacrifice my individual freedom and pool something into security. I think George first on this, because in Europe, masks were not a thing, and we would not like to be controlled in the way in which China sort of locked down. But obviously it worked, huh?
Well, so far, yes. But the problem now is, how do we open up to one another again?
Yeah.
If you are China, that's fine. But if you are Singapore, if we don't open up, we suffocate.
I know, and I come from a small country which is completely dependent on exports and trade as well. And of course, when the whole system breaks down, you run into trouble. How about Michelle? I mean, what was the sentiment? Of course, you had elections coming, and there were these sort of parallel truths going on, and all of this. How can you handle that?
Well, you foreshadowed two of the three responses that I'll share. First, I do believe that this attitude of collective response is always been part of the American character, to be, their own bootstraps. So that's one issue, that the spirit of collectivism isn't part of our inherent DNA. The second thing about that drives this quixotic response to mask wearing is, initially the information was very, very poorly brought forward to the public. The CDC was first against the mask wearing, and then later, as evidence became much more clear about the dynamics of the spread of the virus, did CDC have a clear voice about this. But thirdly, shamelessly, because of our political climate, the mask wearing and now vaccines have become very politicized. And so you would find that people who identify as voting Republican were against the mask, anti-mask, for political, ideological reasons, even more so than the uncertainty of the quality of the science that initially brought forward questions about whether masks were important. And so it's also not unique that public health measures like mask wearing becomes politicized. There's been a long history of politicization of public health types of interventions and health promotion. So all three of these factors, the uncertainty of the science around masks early on, politicization, and then Mandel in his book, The Tyranny of Merit. The American spirit sort of is, we didn't build this, I built this. This individuality spirit complicates a public health response where people are needed to work in a collective action, joint action kind of way.
Very and George, yeah, exactly. And George, in Asia, was there any of this questioning, or was it just, okay, boom, 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 this is what we're going to do, these are the measures we're going to take, basta?
I think it is difficult to generalize across Asia. Certainly trust as a social indicator, trust as a measure of social capital, that has come under severe test. For some countries, that trust level has gone up. in others is come down. And trust is trust into the collective, in your public health authorities, in the media, in government, trust in whether an airline has taken all precautions. So trust is not a big, big issue, and no one is going to really open up without being assured that, well, I can trust a hub, I can trust a system, I can trust a vaccine, I can trust what the government tells me.
Yeah. How about, okay, if we then move on and we start looking at this, because obviously the resilience reform and for resilience commission, what we're trying to do is to make reforms that make societies more resilient to these types of pandemics. And if we start from the premise that the pandemics have many different variants, and they will be with us for a longer time, what would be your, so to say, 3 key lessons for resilience? I mean, what are the measures that you need to take in order for a society, a given country, to be resilient in these types of situations, economically, socially, or from a health perspective? Michelle, do you want to go first?
Yeah, first and foremost, Alex, I think we have to recognize that at least in the US and in other places in the world, we have to look at how we have underinvested in our public health infrastructure and our workforce.
Yeah.
You know, the US is shamelessly underinvested in public health infrastructure, to the tune of, it's estimated that only 3% of all of the funds we spend, and we spend more money than any other nation on health and healthcare, only 3% of that spending is allocated to public health. And that makes no sense when about 80% of the determinants of health are social determinants that are out of the actual primary healthcare system and into communities. It's estimated we need $4.5 billion added to the public health budget to really build a robust infrastructure and support a workforce that is needed to do all of the necessary surveillance and primary prevention types of work to create a healthier, more robust society. The other thing that we need to recognize is our public health institutions like the WHO have a massive mandate, but have been undersupported because of the political and economic structure around how we support an institution that has such a massive mandate. And even in the US, the Centers for Disease Control, you know, its effectiveness to respond to man-made or natural disasters is largely a function of the support, federal support that's provided. And so you have these massive global and federal institutions that have a mandate, but are not always well positioned to be nimble and responsive, to be resilient in the face of threats. And thirdly, I think we have to recognize that public health is too important for just the public sector to manage. We really need to think about a more interdisciplinary, cross-sector, multi-sectorial response to preserving, protecting, and promoting health and wellness of populations on scale. Because if there's anything that we learned from this pandemic, is just how primarily important it is to have a robust public health infrastructure and workforce to keep our national security and economic security humming at the tune that we need to have it. So we have to see public health. We have to recognize that public health is a pillar of strategic investment economically and socially, and not just as a cost center. And if we learn anything from this pandemic, I think is we've got to see public health as an insurance policy, not as just an item on the ledger that's a cost.
Excellent. So invest in public sector infrastructure, work together internationally, keep on supporting organizations like the WHO, and remember that this is not only a public sector issue. How about you, George? What are your sort of 3 takeaways for resilience?
First, the moral dimension. How we behave in the crisis defines us. how people behave in a crisis will affect how they see each other for years to come. At a time when we were desperate, you only look after yourself and your family. I remember that, and I will take that into account. And it is not good times, but pathos, which forges human cultures. At a time like this, we cannot dispense with moral leadership. That when people are selfish, they be exposed as being selfish. That there is a group dimension to worry about, that people who are marginalized, who are poor, have got to be looked after. And there must be moral pressure on one another to do the right thing. So at a time like this, society is either weakened or strengthened morally. So to me, that is a key point. The second point is the honesty of communication. At a time like this, it is natural that there's confusion and mistakes are made, there's a diversity of views. But there's sometimes a tendency for leaders, because they want a specific outcome, to shade the truth, to lean on one argument against another. You do that, you lose credibility, and people stop believing you. And when in a society, no one knows whom to believe, then we have a big problem. So it's extremely important that there be honesty of communication, that bad news be presented as bad news, that when mistakes are made, admit it, mistakes are made, but we're learning and we improve ourselves. And the third point, I think, is psychological preparedness, that we've got to live with this, that viruses and bacteria, they now travel at the speed of jet travel. And many doors are open. And perhaps we've reached the apogee of globalization. And increasingly now, globalization must be accompanied by the evolution of semi-permeable membranes, which separate communities, which separate airflows, which provide some degree of separateness between you and me, so that we are not immediately exposed to one another. That which connects is also that which infects. We are social, therefore we must be connected. But like biological organisms, like cells in the body, there are always membranes which permit good interchange, but build in an immunological system which prevents pathogenic infection. And we've got to live with this. It requires technical knowledge. It requires sophisticated construction of spaces, of how we control airflows in trains and buses, offices, restaurants, aeroplanes. It requires a certain mental preparedness. The more we're connected, the more we must be protected. It's like modern computer systems. The more you're connected to the internet, the more you need antiviral systems built in. And the two have got to move in co-evolution.
Yeah, what do you think of that, Michelle? What's your reaction to it?
I think that is so beautifully stated. And I like the analogy of how we are continually investing in cybersecurity. You can't just say, I've put in the antivirus and I'm done. It has to evolve. It has to evolve as the capacity of the integrity of the system you're trying to protect changes. So I really love that analogy. I also love the fact that George brought up the psychological, and I will add the mental health resilience here, because some will say, and I support this, that at the end of the day, maybe the biggest outcome that we will have, more enduring outcome we'll have of this pandemic, is the toll that the uncertainty, the anxiety that this pandemic has brought on our mental health and wellness. And so I want to just expand on that a bit, because we have to be very thoughtful and strategic about investing in supporting the mental health and wellness of population. The other thing about George's point is, if we've learned anything, it's how deeply interconnected and interdependent we are, and that the solutions will be as importantly, they'll need to be as diffuse and as equitably applied across regions as they've ever been before, because we now know exactly how interconnected we are physically, economically, just for the security of society. We have to find ways to coordinate and better protect across these porous boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, yeah, no, go ahead, George.
I think it's also very sad in the developing world that many countries are discovering how selfish countries can be when they are faced with a challenge like this.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. If I try to bring in a little bit about the earlier conversation that we had, because of course we had, among others, Jose Manuel Barroso, who is the president right now of Gavi, and of course doing a lot of the COVAX work. And he was telling me in our conversation that the aim of Gavi is to distribute 2.3 billion doses to 92 developing countries around the world. And here we come into the discussion that we had after that on disinformation and communication. How do you do this? So very few people know that the biggest sort of vaccine exporter at this particular time is actually the European Union. It surpassed 100 million doses of exports last year. Now, again, is this enough? Probably not. But the whole idea here in the conversation is to say, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that's the mentality that political leaders should have. And one of the conversations we had as well was to say that all political leaders will be judged on 3 criteria: number of fatalities, rollout of vaccines, and then finally recovery of the economy. Now, what's a political leader going to do? He or she is going to focus on the area that he or she is best in. So if you screwed up in the beginning, you forget the deaths. If you're doing well on the vaccines, you say, look, we're ahead of the rest. And if your economy is recovering, you say, wow, look how we got out of this together. I think the mental health point is extremely important. That's something that the previous panel dealt with as well. For instance, Timo Lappi, who had a lot of data on how we've been affected by this. I mean, working, smart working or teleworking might be fun for a little while, but at some stage, it does get a bit lonely. There's nothing that we can do about that. Now, here's a sort of final round of questions, I guess, and that's the sort of, and Michelle, you touched upon it in the beginning, as did you, George. Who is who are the players? Who is responsible? Because quite often we get into this ideological debate that this is a public sector thing. I said, no, the markets will do this. I mean, who, or is it the countries? Is it the regions? Is it the companies? Or is it all of the above? Should I start with George this time around? Who should be doing this?
Well, I would build from myself. If the person is responsible, he will look after the family. If the family is responsible, the village will be looked after. Then the country. I don't think the solutions for a challenge like this can come from the big to the small. It must emerge from the small to the big. But the big must reinforce the small. Without the small, policies on the big cannot work. And I like very much Michelle's point that this is a very cruel virus. It's not very dangerous compared to SARS or Ebola or smallpox, but it stops something which is so quintessential to being a human being, which is our sociality and our ability to interact and to emote with our parents and grandparents. The virus prevents us from being emotional towards one another. We cover our faces and we can't read each other. So the psychological dimension of this pandemic, to me, is much more serious than the actual deaths that it causes. And we must address this. I mean, there's so much harm done to individuals and to relationships. And I don't think they are fully analyzed or even reported on.
I think that's an interesting and good way of bringing it about as well. And the question is, do we go back to the type of a social life that we used to have, an interaction? Of course, I'm a Finn, and if I'm allowed to a little bit joke here, what the reaction in Finland was when people said 2 meters social distancing. why do we have to be so close to each other? But you know, we all have different cultures, so it is what it is. But Michelle, what do you think? I mean, I like the way in which George framed it, to go from the small to the big. So basically individual responsibility and then backup from the big players.
I completely agree, actually. I completely agree. It has to start with the individual, the family, the community, the state, the country, the region. It's this layered response, and it has to be layered because of the very strong behavioral component that is a fundamental part for building resilience against a pandemic or against threats that are, name your other threats, climate change, etc. But there has to be a recognition that there is a top-down type of role here too. And that has to be surveillance. That has to be coordinated, thoughtful reporting of evidence based on science, not on ideology. And then there must be a coordinated response, having resources stocked away. Shamelessly in the US, we did not have fundamental supplies. We did not have the stockpile of medicines, of personal protective equipment, or a plan to strategically distribute them in an equitable way. So it really has to be that full chain of responsibility with very clear coordinated responsibility in communication, management, and surveillance at a national and regional level that rolls up then to global cooperation and collaboration. And so it is all of the above. It is very challenging. It is not one solution, one and done. It requires the discipline of continued effort in monitoring and preparing responses for this pandemic and the next one. And we have an opportunity to learn from the painful lessons that we've all experienced in the last 13 months.
I think this is a very good point to end on. And you know what brings to mind and sort of sums up everything that we've discussed is that we have now had a global collective experience about a pandemic and what it means to us individually, what it means to our families, to our communities, to our regions, states, and countries. And I think that experience will live with us for a long time. Of course, it has been asymmetric, some people have died, others haven't. There have been economic hits, social hits, etc., etc. But perhaps this is a sort of, how do I say, global alarm clock that we need to start caring about each other, that we need to take care of ourselves, that we need to find common solutions. Now, what we are going to do in our work in the Commission, Reform for Resilience, is to have takeaways from the seminar and discussion summit that we've had here today. We'll keep on collecting evidence and we'll do an interim report for the G7 meeting this summer in the UK. And we will also do a memo of these discussions that we've had. I would like to personally thank you, Michelle and George, for being in our last panel. I would like to thank our audience and once again apologize for the technical problems that we had, but that's what happens sometimes in these kinds of situations. It's been a lovely day for us at the School of Transnational Governance, and we wish everyone a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
Ciao! Are you Da Vinci or Machiavelli? Come and discover your way to change global policy. Best place to do it, European University Institute's School of Transnational Governance. This is where we train future leaders.